Also, you can share with us what ancestral or Indigenous territory you're on. In our case, it's the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and covered by Treaty 13, the Williams Treaty, and home, as we know, to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. We at CUI continue to wrestle with this and try to figure out what our how do we actually do truth and the reconciliation components, both of these things. And I think in terms of this lens that we're going to bring to around disasters and how we cope with disasters, of course, Indigenous peoples would have years and years and years and years and years of experience of what happens when a challenge caused by human settlement completely disrupts the land and the ecosystems in which they operate. So this is fundamentally a reconciliation exercise for all of us. And I'm going to ask my co-panelists to come on and expose their screens so you can see them. As I said, we're appreciative that people are joining us from different parts of North America today. And also to say that this is American Thanksgiving week in the US. For Canadians, Americans assume that we don't know these things, but of course we watch your television and we see all the Black Friday ads. So we know that Thursday is your big day, and I'm a dual citizen, as are a number of people I know in our network here. And so we appreciate people coming in. That's why we adjusted, and normally City Talk will be later in the week. This week it's today on a Tuesday, so that those of our American colleagues who are taking a holiday and start to travel tomorrow can join us. So thanks, everybody. Really, really important conversation. Probably, is there one that's more important? I doubt it. But in terms of how we actually come to terms with what we've learned, we, on the 7th of December at CUI, are going to mark COVID 1000. Believe it or not, the 7th of December, I think it's technically the 6th, but we're going on the 7th, is when we mark 1,000 days since the World Health Organization labeled this a global emergency. And that's a long 1,000 days. I feel like we all just need to take a breath about what we've been through. And then part of what we're collectively, what we've been through, and part of what we're at CUI trying to pivot to, since that's a very popular COVID word, is what are the lessons? You know, what will the COVID legacy be? In terms of how we do city building differently? What are we going to take from this extraordinary global period of time? And what have we learned, and what will stick? We had, through City Talk, through this series that we've been doing since April of 20, we've been saying what's working, what's not, and what's next. And I think for us now, the next question is, and what needs to stick? So Daniel, I'm so pleased to have you here because you're a scholar on this stuff, and you and I got to know each other in New Orleans after Katrina, and you spent your career building this knowledge around how do we actually learn from, integrate, and change how we do things as a result of some dramatic kind of disaster. So I'm going to go to you first, and then you're in Boston today, and we're really appreciative of you joining us, and then I'll continue to swing around, each of you to say something in the you know, your opening perspective, and then we'll have a good conversation. And people on the chat, remember, whatever you put in the chat stays in the chat, because we publish the chat, and we also publish the video here. So, and then people watch it and they continue to learn. So Daniel, thanks for joining us. Over to you.
Thanks for having me. So I guess I'd start by pointing out that even in 2022, the ways that we handle shocks and disasters are very much rooted in old school traditional approaches. Typically, after a shock or disaster, we get in food and water, maybe medical supplies, if it's of America to some other country, or can aid to some other country. It's the same kind of thing with beds and tents, and we walk away. And oftentimes, the real drivers of recovery and resilience are completely ignored. And those actual drivers come from the connections in the community itself, not outside aid, not assistance, not sweaters that we send that are climatically inappropriate, or food, it's not belonging there, but really the community itself. So we're looking forward to a conversation today on the ways that the community itself already has the seeds of recovery inside it, and the ways that we can think about it as residents, as activists and NGO members, of helping communities to activate those ties.
Absolutely. And it's interesting for me to hear you say this, because of course you and I intersected when I was in New Orleans, and I, like you, stood there watching with great interest that in fact it was mutual aid networks that formed up and actually self-organized their own kinds of solutions, which we've been seeing during COVID as well. And there was an expectation, at least in America, that a national authority called FEMA was going to somehow come in and solve it all. And as you said, beds and tents. And I don't know if you remember this moment as well as I do, Daniel, but Karen Gadbois, who was one of the local organizers in New Orleans, who was an artist, and I think we've had her on City Talk, I'm trying to remember, but she was an artist who found herself being the documenter of the erosion of her neighborhood after the storm, and whether it was going to be restored in ways that people could find their way back. And she said, you know, for a long time, we kept thinking the cavalry was coming, that they'd come over the hill. And then they realized after a long time, year and a half, that they weren't coming. And that her expression was that we are the ones that we've been waiting for. And in terms of all the different research that you've done, Daniel, have you seen that repeat? Is that being reinforced regularly?
Absolutely. Actually, to begin with my own story, back in 2005, in fact, our own house was destroyed in Lakeview. So I had this very naive conception of disaster recovery. And I had this vision of the ACH, the clearinghouse check, come to me with this big 8-foot-long check, right? Giving me back the value of the house and its contents from FEMA, or maybe private insurance. And neither the state nor the market stepped in, as you said already quite well. The people that got my family and I out of that position of having no job, no house, no possessions, our car was submerged like a submarine. People that helped us get out, of course, were the friends of friends networks and all that kind of stuff. And absolutely, that moment in my own life pivoted me away from my old research, which is completely irrelevant at this point, into this field of disasters and shocks. And since then, I've done work in a number of countries, India, Israel, Japan, back in the Gulf Coast. And yes, over and over again, even though the forms of the networks are quite different. So for example, after the 2004 tsunami in the Indian Ocean, the ways that local communities organized were quite different, let's say the North American communities or Japan communities. But nonetheless, it's the same form of the networks that we're seeing, right? What we call bonding, bridging, and linking ties. Bonding ties between people who are similar, bridging ties between people who are different, and then linking ties which are vertical. And I would argue, I think after a lot of research now, that those horizontal and vertical ties, you can tell pretty quickly before shock how communities will do afterwards, based on the distribution of that ability to internally have a vision, trust, engagement, and then to what degree are they listened to by decision makers, to what degree do they trust local authorities, regional authorities, to what degree are they actually at the table of decision making.
And that's reinforced in Eric Kleinenberg's work, you know, that early piece of work he did when he wrote his PhD on the Chicago heat wave. And he showed that this is heat wave. Somebody can put it into the chat, Eric Kleinenberg, where he showed that the parts of Chicago that fared better during that heat wave were the areas that actually had those ties in that social network and the areas that were more isolated. James, you're in the belly of the beast there. Not that we want to call Florida a beast, just saying, but you are on the front lines of this repeatedly. And what Daniel and I are talking about is from 2005, which 17 years ago. And I remember when the term resilience first surfaced in that discourse. Prior to that, resilience was only talked about really in the psychology domain about individual resilience. So whereas you, James, now 17 years later, you're confronted with this all the time. So let's get a perspective from you in Florida, and then I'm going to come to you, Julie, to get to your piece, and then Jeb, you'll do cleanup. Go ahead, James. Nice to have you.
Oh, thank you, Mary. Thank you for the invitation to participate. This is a great opportunity. You know, my perspective on this is really tracks my own professional experience working in the United States, but primarily in Florida, where back in 2005 and before, I was running the state of Florida emergency management operations when we would experience our share of hurricanes and tornadoes, floods, you know, and we were directly involved with incident management. That's the classic FEMA control structure, reactive. And much of what happened in Florida stems from the tragic situation we found ourselves in after Hurricane Andrew in 1992. So we have built a very sophisticated emergency management operation, which self-funds itself and is even into insurance, wind insurance. Now, what happened to me professionally was I left that role and went to the university where I had an opportunity to work at Florida Atlantic University at a research center that started to get into climate adaptation, started to understand the whole range of issues that were ahead of us in terms of the change in conditions. And then working with Jeb and the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities program really brought me to the job I'm in today as the Chief Resilience Officer for the 7th largest county And now we really do think of emergency management and incident management in the context of other shocks and stresses that are occurring in our community. And we've had our share from a building collapse to the hurricanes and you know, back when we were developing the resilient strategy with the assistance of the Rockefeller Foundation, we had an experience with a mosquito-borne disease called Zika that actually found its way from our neighbors to the south into our tourist-dominated community. And a disease of that nature that could have unintended health impacts is you know, shocks a tourist economy. We were able to manage that. And so in our strategy, we put this was 2018-19, we put the need to prepare ourselves for future pandemics. So when the pandemic hit, it wasn't the health department, it wasn't the emergency management department, it was the resilience office that had conceptually thought about this. We didn't have anything identified at all that we're going to meet the needs of the challenges that came later. But it's because we had thought broadly about shocks and stresses. We had built a strategy, partnered with the 34 municipalities in our county, with our adjacent counties. We continue. That's our approach today, is to use a resilience strategic approach to deal with these, especially the shocks, but the stresses of things like affordable housing, transportation, mobility, equity issues, income disparity, all those in the context of dealing with these emergencies. I'd end at this point, though, Mary, saying that what we have found is a real resilience within our community groups, especially not-for-profits. They are, you know, this is a community that has over 60% of our residents were born in another country. So there are language barriers. There are certainly parts of our community that don't have official status, and they're not always comfortable going into the, you know, to the FEMA-run disaster relief office. And so we have a rich array of not-for-profits who have created resilience hubs. We even have a resilience pod, which is a 40-foot container outfitted to mobile, take it into different communities to get out information. All of that happens a lot easier in some of our communities than if we did sort of an official entrance. And we're learning that, we're building that strength within our community. Thanks.
You know, it's so interesting to hear how resilience has just become part of our parlance, right? And the Rockefeller, it helps when you've got $100 million and you go and establish resilience officers. But it was also, I think, the foresight of Judy Roden, who wrote a book called The Resilience Dividend, which I've sort of stolen from to call about to ask what's the COVID dividend, this notion. So I might, Jeb, we could come to you next because James gave you a perfect segue, but I'm going to stick with my order because I want to go to Julie, because it's interesting, you know, Julie, you're a social worker, trained as a social worker. My sister's a social worker. And when I sort of stumbled into this world, because I was in New Orleans, I learned about this concept of resilience, but my sister sort of looked at me with like the only way a sister can, like, duh, you know, of course, resilience. And that the social work community has been thinking about resilience at the individual scale and the family scale for years, right? And I know that your focus of your work is on the people side of this. So do you want to speak a bit to that? And then Jeb, we'll go back to the broader conversation about resilience around the world. Go ahead, Julie, give us your perspective.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be here today. So as a social worker and a researcher in this area now for about 15 years, the field of disaster social work is one that's emerging, influenced by different positionings like green social work, which are some new paradigms that are emerging, that are really recognizing the important role that the natural and physical environment plays in people's lives and how people are also affecting the environment. And here I'm located on Treaty 6 territory. I'm in the city of Edmonton, and just recognizing that here in the province of Alberta, some very major disasters have taken place here over the last decade, with the 2013 floods in southern Alberta, and then the 2016 wildfire in northern Alberta and Fort McMurray. And I've had the opportunity to be engaged in some large partnership research projects looking at some of the impacts of these disasters and what they mean for people. And I would say this is a real strength that social work brings to this conversation, is a focus on the social dimensions and how these events, so natural hazard disasters that are exacerbated by climate change, are impacting marginalized or disadvantaged individuals and groups, and kind of what that looks like. And maybe to provide some context, in Canada, we know that there are a number of natural hazard disasters that have taken place. Over the last 100 years, the count's at 844 of these: floods, severe storms, extreme cold, drought, wildfires, earthquakes, landslides, and epidemics. So, we are experiencing these impacts across the country from coast to coast. And we know that these extreme weather events are now costing us more in economic terms, about $2 billion annually. And this is increased by about $500 million from a decade ago. Many people are being impacted across all levels of society. And my research has looked at the role of social workers and other human service professionals who are part of the social service workforce, and really calling for a more holistic and a whole of society approach in addressing some of the risks and looking at all phases of disaster and how we can do things differently to foster greater community resilience. So I'm happy to be here and join this conversation today.
Yeah, and this notion of community resilience. So it really is a concept that scales. I, as an individual, have resilience. My household has resilience, my block, my district, and then the notion of community resilience. I'm a fellow with Shorefast, which is just for the benefit of Daniel and James, because you might not know, it's a Canadian charity that is focused on rural economic development. And it's a social enterprise that funds it, based in Fogo Island, Newfoundland, which is like 2,600 people, very, very remote in the northeast coast of the Atlantic. And they're completely seized with what their resilience is: economic resilience, social resilience, all that stuff. Jeb, we're going to come to you next, because you've been in this game. I don't want to say this because we're about the same age, but you've been in it for a while. And you did, of course, found the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, which was really a precursor to notions of resilience. And we're going to, as I said, have them next week. But here you are now in the sort of a next iteration of resilience work, working globally. So give us a sense from your perspective where you think the discourse is. And have we made the progress that we need to have made? I know the answer is probably no, but you know what I mean. Give us a sense of where you think we are.
Actually, I think the understanding is deep and rich, and it's across all sectors. It's hats off to the social workers who brought the concept forward to us, right? So, and family therapy and social workers, the understanding of resilience at that level of the individual and the family and the community, it comes from that. And then around 2000, we realized, I remember I was advising the UN Disaster Response Organization on making cities resilient. It was 2001. And so already people were trying to think about, well, what's this mean for cities and urban planning and things like that. So it's been out there a lot. And I think even more importantly is we've all had so many experiences. And I think Jim, you've relayed experiences, Dan, you've relayed experiences, Julie, you had a whole list of them, from which we've learned from the disaster events and what it took to respond effectively from them, what we need to do in terms of preparedness. And I guess one thing I wanted to say, because I don't know how many people are participating today who are from the disaster preparedness space or from the risk management space, not just chief resilience officers, but chief risk officers and their fold. But I think it's important to contextualize this new language of resilience in the context of why it's emerged out of risk management. And so quickly this, there are so many strains in the systems in our world because we defunded government, because we haven't kept up with infrastructure investment, because of climate change, many, many things that are resulting in a reality we live in this century, where we're going to see more and more of these multi-hazard events or multi-crisis events happen concurrently. So we just went through one. Obviously, that's a case in point. And now we have future scenarios for which all of the actuarial data, all of the data that drove us understanding what's the risk we're managing from the point of view of who's exposed, what's the exposure, and what's the probability that some event's going to happen, we can't use that effectively any longer. So that whole part of risk management, which is hazard analysis and understanding the probability side of the equation, is getting less and less viable. And that's why insurers, you know, to your territory, Jim, insurers are asking whether we can have an insurance market in Florida, because probability isn't something we can understand any longer. Hazard and the interactions of hazards, we can't understand them. So where does that leave us if you're in the disaster preparedness space? The other part of the equation is vulnerability. So it's probability times vulnerability. So we need to understand vulnerabilities much more richly and put our resources there. So we're taking what we've learned from the back end of things we haven't responded to, and we're saying now, actually, risk management is vulnerability reduction. Part of that is adaptive capacity as part of vulnerability, part of the equation. And so I think to come to the point, where is it at? I think what happened with us in resilience, we've created this kind of whole movement and this jargon, and it's a little mystical, right? So we have this, I know at Rockefeller Foundation, it was even hard for some of the people at Rockefeller saying, what are you talking about? And you're probably with you, Jim, as an agent of this discourse in Miami-Dade County, you got the same response, like, what is this language? But really it comes back to basic risk management. We need to be in the business of vulnerability reduction and adaptive capacity building. And we've known this for a long time. I'll go back to my ICLEI. One of the first case studies I wrote for ICLEI was a Kobe earthquake in 1995. And what did they conclude from Kobe? It was these local neighborhood groups, to your point, Daniel, it was these local neighborhood groups that actually did the disaster response. And then they institutionalized it in the city. They created an institution of, you know, local community groups that sort of manage risks in the community. We're doing it now with resilience hubs. That's the movement we're in the middle of now. In a rural context, in 2000, 2001, early 2000s, I started working with women's self-help groups, microcredit groups in rural India, and huge networks, 60,000 women in one network of women's self-help. And when one of the largest historical earthquakes in South India happened, the Bhuj earthquake, and flattened 3,000 plus villages, it was those groups who both responded, the women's groups, who had no status. I mean, women in rural India don't have a lot of status in their own right, but it was those organized groups that were effective respondents. And then that when all the institutions failed to get reconstruction money out to the villages to rebuild homes, were totally ineffective. It was the women's groups that became the interlocutors between the village and the money sources and state and federal government in India. So we've learned it over and over and over again. And, you know, in a way, it's kind of like, why has it taken decades to do so? I think because we've largely, many of us in the world have been sheltered from these shocks, but the evidence is profuse now. And so let me close with two observations in terms of what it means. I mean, obviously we've talked about multi-benefit design, you know, so every dollar we spend to develop or repair infrastructure, we have to think about vulnerability. That's a key thing. And I think resilience design process is making its headway. We need to respect, to your point, Daniel, Mary, all of us sing for the same hymn sheet. We need to understand how central these community networks are and community groups are in the context of sparing lives and reducing costs of the disasters we're going to get hit by. So like, go back to Kobe. Kobe learned something, we need to learn it in our cities around the world. And then the last thing that I learned from COVID, because we were involved quite a bit in helping cities with their recovery plans in the last few years, is that there's this whole train of things people want to do in cities. Mary, in our case, bike lanes in Toronto. Like, so Dan Egan, our longtime colleague, spent 20 years trying to advocate that we should have a real bike lane system in Toronto. All of that stuff was on the books. And when the COVID crisis happened, oh my God, did we build bike lanes everywhere. So if we can learn from that as well, that we have these proposals, we're trying to push through a system that don't have enough support yet, but we need to help articulate what the resilience value is of doing some of these things. What's the resilience value of investing more in community centers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that helps enrich in the notion of what is the value of investments that there's resistance to. So let me leave it at that for now, but thanks for
thanks, Jeb. I mean, just listening to you guys, the dilemma, and Gal, the dilemma that we've got here is that, and I think it's fundamentally such a problem, is that these are long-term investments. And we're all dealing with short-term political windows. And it's so difficult, isn't it, to shake out the investments that we need. And as you say, and I don't want us to depress everybody. We don't want to be depressed on a Tuesday, but as you say, we've known some of this stuff for so long. I have a question generally for the group, and I'm going to ask everybody to open your mics, and we can all, and some people are already putting questions into the chat, which I'll relay. But one is this dynamic between efficiency. We somehow fell in love with efficiency 35 or 40 years ago, and we decided redundancy was bad. And efficiency and lean process was good. And then all it takes is some kind of an event or shock that knocks some people out, and we don't have the capacity to be able to rebound. So do you think we can, I'm going to ask you, Julie, this question, can we restore our understanding of the value of redundancy, get rid of the pejorative nature, call it something else, so that we can bulk ourselves up, so that we can cope with whatever? Do you guys talk about that in your domain? Julie first.
This might be a little bit outside my area, but I do think that what we're seeing is that to build resilience, we need to invest in the delivery of social services and programs that can help build that capacity at different levels. Right. And so some of my work looks at social development perspectives and how we can bridge together social with economic and environmental dimensions together. And also, I think, investing in social protection. So, you know, we have seen some evidence of this during the COVID pandemic in Canada. And so part of this is, you know, opening up some new conversations and really thinking about those kinds of investments and how they can contribute to greater resilience. Because like Jeb was mentioning, climate risks are shifting, are changing, but they're also affecting people in different ways. Not everyone is affected by these events in the same way. So we need to also create greater collaborative work at the community level, move away from top-down approaches, and really think about what do these diverse impacts look like, and how they affect disadvantaged peoples and disadvantaged communities in greater ways.
I was going to ask you actually what your reaction was to Jeb's notion of use of the term vulnerable, because I am concerned that out of this process, and you know, there's a whole community of people that hate the term resilience because they feel what it's doing is just basically giving license to put another group through a hardship to show, well, look how resilient they are. And the vulnerability piece doesn't speak to the assets. In fact, all of us here are actually coming at this, I think, in terms of building the assets of people to be able to work together to respond, right? So what is the term vulnerability used, Julie, in your domain, or is there a preferred term you're using?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I would say in social work, we look at a variety of social identity factors. Okay. You know, so if we think about intersectionality and what that looks like, at a theoretical level, it includes a variety of identity factors: age, gender, ability, culture, ethnic background, immigration status. Many different factors of diversity contribute to how people experience different events, let's say, in their lives. And you know, some of those factors can be positive and assets, and in other aspects, they might present more challenging areas or come up as barriers. And so I think, you know, in looking from my perspective in social work, I would say in some cases, the term vulnerable and marginalized populations or communities are used, but maybe more thinking about disadvantaged individuals or groups. Again, looking at those diverse identity factors. Because one of the things that I've seen in my research in British Columbia, looking at some of the impacts of wildfires in rural communities, is that the impacts are very different from one community to the next in the same wildfire season. And some of these communities are, 100 kilometers away from one another. So, we can't have these sort of top-down tailored approach to say this is what recovery looks like. We really need to understand what are those assets, what are those strengths, move away from deficit-focused approaches to really think about what are the strengths and assets and abilities, and what do community members bring in thinking about recovery in different ways.
Right. I mean, I think that's kind of what I was responding to around asset-based. Go ahead, Daniel. Were you going to chime in?
Yeah, I just had a two-finger on what Julie pointed out there. Several ideas. One is that the idea of vulnerability, we're always really careful in our research, never to blanket statement group X is vulnerable, because we've discovered in our research, for example, with the Ibasho project in Japan, that many elderly whom I assumed going in were vulnerable were the opposite. They'd already been through war and hardships without water, electricity for weeks, if not months. They were the ones ready in the 311 disasters in Japan to help bounce back and teach the younger generations, how do you get water from mountain streams and make sure it's clean? Where do you go to the bathroom when there's no bathrooms working? How do you deal with a lack of Wi-Fi and other things? So we're very careful with that term vulnerability to make sure, typically what we see is, as Julie said, this intersection. So it's not just being elderly by itself, it's being elderly and isolated socially. As you said already, Mary, that was what we saw with the work from Kleinenberg, right? Eric Kleinenberg's work on heat wave pointed out it wasn't just being elderly or being poor, it was being elderly, poor, and socially isolated. That combination then put people over the edge for being at risk. A second idea you mentioned before, efficacy or efficiency and redundancy. I would argue actually the problem we have in our society, at least in North America, is cost-benefit analysis versus social benefit analysis. Cost-benefit says we could build this new seawall, we could build this new concrete structure to keep back the water, or we could figure out the social benefits from building more bottom-up infrastructure like libraries, parks, community centers that will help build collective action. And actually, I've got a paper coming out shortly that tries to argue both monetarily and in terms of mortality. For example, building a library, building a community center is just as valuable, in fact, as building a seawall in many communities.
Wow.
Because the social spillover effects that come out of that social infrastructure are comparable to what you get from saving, let's say, 10 or 15 lives by having 4 more feet of concrete in the wall. So I think it's not redundancy per se that's the problem, but this question of how do we measure the benefits from these networks? How do we understand social infrastructure? Again, parks, libraries, places that build connections versus, let's say, physical infrastructure, large-scale projects built by governments to keep out water.
We'll be keen to see that paper because we are working with libraries across the country about this. This notion that Jim mentioned about resilience hubs, then we saw during COVID that these places became just pivotally important. A question that my colleague Robert Plitt's posting in the chat, he's in Calgary, he's asking, if in fact you had the kind of resilient infrastructure that Daniel, you've been calling for since you started your scholarship, and Jeb and Jim, you're involved in this through 100 Resilient Cities. If you had had that in place, would we have managed COVID differently? What do you think, Jim?
Wow. Throwing in COVID, I think, is the challenge. I think that it was so pervasive. It touched every institution, educational, medical, employment, transportation. I mean, it didn't leave anybody untouched in terms of its impacts. And I think everybody was scrambling because we were all vulnerable. And we didn't have any track record to understand how to address it. I mean, we had professionals giving advice, right, but in terms of societal understanding and leadership, there was a lot of lacking.
But if you'd had infrastructure in place, just a second, I just want to push for Miami first. If you'd had some infrastructure in place, would it have made a difference? And what kind of infrastructure would have been useful?
Well, I mean, infrastructure to us, I think the classic definition, and we're a large county, so we provide all of the basic infrastructure for our citizens and visitors. Mm-hmm. We can keep that running, but if the users are displaced from their normal lives, then everything our whole structure is, our financial structure, because if people in a consumer society, if they're not spending money, then the sales tax goes down. If the community is basic foundation economically starts to become uncertain, and then investment goes down, then so do property taxes. So I mean, the reason we had such enormous relief programs, many not well thought out, but unprecedented in terms of the amount of money that the federal government put out, is because they just basically had no other alternative but to send money.
They didn't know what else to do. Yeah, I mean,
they didn't know what to do, and some of that money is still sitting in accounts in local governments in Florida, I know, and hopefully we're putting it to good use. But
it doesn't appear to be. It doesn't appear to be sitting in local government accounts in Canada and Canadian cities. It seems to be perhaps sitting in personal accounts.
Yeah, well, but I mean, really, if you look at the numbers, there's never been. I mean, it makes the infrastructure bill that the Congress passed to help us look minor in compared to the billions, trillions of dollars that flowed because we had no certain path forward to deal with that. The uncertainties of the pandemic.
That's a kind of disturbing thing, as you say, all the money that we ended up throwing at something as opposed to what we might have intentionally planned. Daniel first, and then to Jeb. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Daniel.
just sorry, two thoughts on James' points. One is we actually have a paper coming out in a month with Courtney Page-Tan and Summer Marion with the Russell Sage Foundation. They exactly looked at this question: was what happened in communities with more or less trust to behaviors that we know saved lives. And the bottom line from that paper is that the communities with more horizontal trust, they knew their neighbors, they worked together, and more vertical trust to their decision makers, they had more protective behaviors. That is, they wore masks, they socially distanced, they stayed out of outside behaviors. We've got another paper coming out with Tim Fraser. We show at the regional and national levels, communities after vaccines came out that had more trust, had more uptake in vaccines. That is, they took on the vaccines because they believed the information they're getting from people like Fauci and so forth. Other communities with less trust, vertically and horizontally, those were ones that in fact didn't take up the vaccine. So we actually have almost like a natural experiment here across, at least in North America, in the United States at least, we have very, very different kind of communities with levels of trust in the government and each other. And we saw COVID outcomes that directly came out of those. I think we had something like 90% of the variation in outcomes predicted on this question of social capital and trust.
And do you
look, this is so totally politicized now, right? We don't politicize emergency management. That is bipartisan, is everything. This whole dealing with the pandemic has become a political divisive issue, and it is having
Isn't that interesting
in our elections. So I don't know how to put that in the context of resilience or anything else. There's nothing that I know of in my, that compares to what happened to the way political leaders decide to use that issue.
Yeah, it's so interesting, Nobody fights by building a bridge or building a wall, but when it comes to actually something that affects them as personally as a vaccination or whatever, it's a really interesting point you've made, Jim. Go ahead, Jeb.
Yeah, so back to this thing of vulnerability, because to me it's very core to, so I'm very involved in creating standards around climate adaptation investment now on an international basis. And it's interesting, the discussion on vulnerability. The vulnerability measurement is at the heart of what we call climate adaptation. I'll speak to it. So in no way am I using the term, am I suggesting there's a label for a group as a vulnerable group or not a vulnerable group. When you do an investment to adapt to climate risks that are emerging, you look at the vulnerability of a building, you look at the vulnerability of an HVAC system, you look at the vulnerability of the bridge, you could look at the vulnerability of certain groups, but you never do it as a blanket assumption. And this is the challenge of doing resilience work. For each investment you make to adapt to climate or to address any future harm scenario, you have to evaluate specific to the project site and specific to the stakeholders affected by it, who's going to suffer what kinds of harms and losses under what scenarios that may emerge. And then with climate is a great exemplar of how we've moved from predictive values and understanding what those harms and losses would be to the world that Jim works in particular. Who knows which climate scenario is going to emerge in Miami-Dade County next 20 years? We do know certain things. There's going to be increased flooding because it's already happening, but we don't know how things are going to interact with one another. So if we can't, and I'm happy to accept other words, if for some reason in another sphere, vulnerability has come to mean something else. But here's important: if we're trying to link up with a disaster risk management world, it's going to be hard to throw vulnerability out, not because it's a label that they've attached to anyone, but because it's actually a critical measurement in understanding what we should be doing with our dollars and investments. So it's an interesting debate, and we probably don't want to have the
well, maybe
the whole
it's maybe just maybe it's just a point for you in your world to flag this, that it can be heard as a abnegation of the inherent assets and strengths of the community that you're putting into that category. Right?
Part of vulnerability is adaptive capacity, which is assets and strengths. So anyway,
yeah,
I mean, that is a big emphasis of what we're looking at when we do vulnerability assessment. But in that case, in my world, working with developing country contexts and things like that, I'm not coming across the sensitivity. So it may be more one that's happening within our world here in North America.
Well, it's certainly with the equity conversation, of which, you know, I'm not the qualified person to speak about.
The key thing is we don't throw away the critical task that needs to be done to understand how we move from a more actuarial approach to risk management to one where we're doing resilience investment work.
Well, and I want to talk about the actuarial component, but Julie, over to you first, and then we'll talk about money. Go ahead, Julie.
Hey, thanks. I just wanted to say, I think, you know, going back to your question about infrastructure, and would that have made a difference? I think one of the lessons that we learned in the 2016 Alberta wildfire recovery is that nonprofits and community organizations that moved to electronic systems and adopted technology in their practice felt that they were better prepared to manage the shift to virtual and remote work during COVID-19. So Fort McMurray was a city of about 88,000 people, and the entire city population was evacuated in 24 hours in May of 2016 with the wildfire. So a number of social service agencies and community organizations and nonprofits were in a position where if they wanted to maintain access with their populations, they needed to make that shift remotely. So I think, you know, in terms of investing in infrastructure and thinking about community practice, we've seen the increase in the use of technology during COVID. I think that we're seeing that this is continuing in different forms with blended approaches, and this is something that will continue. On the topic of kind of looking at climate risks and notions of vulnerability, I'd like to bring in environmental justice into our conversation today, because I think, you know, what we're seeing now as well is that with environmental justice, even if we are able to identify those who might be disadvantaged or face those heightened risks, if we don't adopt an environmental justice component, it means that people don't have the power or ability to seek the kinds of solutions to address the problems that they're experiencing. And so this unequal and differentiated positioning can place some very heavy burdens on those who are at risk or have less power to be able to address some of these root causes. So I just like to bring this into our conversation because we certainly saw at the recent COP conference discussions on climate justice. And in social work, we take the position that social justice is environmental justice and climate justice. And so how we can integrate social and economic and environmental justice into this conversation, I think, is critical.
You know, it absolutely is. And it's interesting, again, going back to just another shout out for my sister who you have that whole, your discipline sees things from the whole. You do. And you understand that a person's contentment and their evolution is dependent on a whole bunch of factors. And I really appreciate that. And I often think that the social work approach is what we need in terms of main streets or neighborhoods. We need that kind of case management, holistic approach as we look at neighborhoods and their capacity to be resilient. I want to ask a question about money and decentralization, because I struggle with this, that we are all working in environments that are highly centralized. Both Daniel and Jim have described FEMA and the lockstep of emergency management. We've got the same situation in Canada where disaster relief is held federally. And yet I think we're all talking here about incubating local solutions, local capacity. So how do we square that? How could we, I'm going to go to you first, Jim. How could we imagine getting more money to be under the control of local something or others who could then invest it in the way that they think is appropriate, as opposed to the way it is now, which is petitioning up the scale. And maybe Jeb, you can comment because you're working around the world. Maybe there are places that are doing this. Jim and then Jeb.
So at our level, we've formed a real strong partnership with our community foundation, the Miami Foundation. They were a partner from the very beginning in developing the resilience strategy. They continue to be a partner. You know, domestic in this country, in this state, government can sometimes be very slow to react to new situations, and the philanthropy flow of dollars can sometimes be directed very quickly. And by the way, my mayor, who I report to, Daniela Levine-Cava, is a social worker, and she has 4 E's that she operates under: equity, environment, economy, and engagement. And our budget, our $10 billion budget is organized around those 4 E's. My strategic plan for my office is organized around those 4 E's. So we, in big organizations, whoever's on the top and who sets those values is going to have a big impact. And having a big impact in a large government is how you spend your money. Yep. So we have, you know, we spend a lot of money on physical infrastructure, but we also try to find ways to get money to our community-based organizations that can more easily and work with some of the communities. Again, our communities are unique, not maybe unique to all parts of the borderland areas of large countries, but we are constantly receiving refugees, constantly, daily, from Haiti and Cuba. And we have to have a society that's able to handle those changes within our community.
Jim, let's have the 4 E's again. Equity,
economy, environment,
and
engagement.
Great. Somebody asked for them. We'll put them into the chat. Thanks. Jeb, comment from you in terms of.
So what it brings to my mind is 2 of our programs and how we're trying to address this issue of getting more priority attention to and more resources to, and particularly communities that you know, are under-resourced, low wealth communities that are exposed. So the first is when one of the first big wildfires in Southern California occurred, the Hilton Foundation approached us and said, and their foundation building almost burnt down. So they had a great interest in what was going on there. And we started working with a set of partners first in Southern California on their exposure and vulnerability, if I can use the word, to wildfires, which extreme events. And that led to our establishing a program called the California Resilience Partnership, which is an alliance of actors from the neighborhood to the, I'm going to go through the list you went through, Mary, earlier, from the neighborhood to the district, to the city, to the region, to the state government, including the governor's office, which is involved in this partnership. And over the last 2.5, 3 years, through the California Resilience Partnership, we've managed to do any number of things to make sure that critical messages are flowing both ways. We just did a huge landscape report for all of the regions of California, where basically we gave input to the state. They've just allocated $4 billion to local community resilience planning, but they don't know how to set that up so communities can actually access it and use it well. So to design big programs, $4 billion programs, they'll be followed up with $10 billion of project investments. So creating these alliances that touch on all the scales becomes critical just for people to get aligned about resourcing and where the resources are needed. Then there's a lot of work to be done, and that often is the case between the municipality, the city or the county government, and the more marginalized neighborhood that's never been treated well by the municipality. So we have a resilient neighborhoods program. There are many programs like this in North America, I know. To give an example of ours, we have been working with one of the most climate exposed areas of Houston, Northeast Houston. Every time there's any kind of a tropical storm, it gets flooded. It's a Black neighborhood. It was red it was ignored. It's nothing that Black neighborhoods in the United States have gone through. And what this program is all about is building an effective working relationship between that neighborhood and the people, even in City Hall, who own resilience, the people in the planning department that own Complete Communities program. Even between those organizations in the municipality in that neighborhood, there wasn't a good working relationship. So I think a lot of the getting the resources to has to do first with actually getting effective working relationships and dynamics happening, the kind of social work of urbanism.
Yeah, and
Go
someone's raised in the chat, what about trust? I mean, this is the dilemma.
Exactly.
We have
Trust.
communities that have been historically
Yeah.
Marginalized and wronged. It's very, very difficult. And then you've got all the other barriers, Jim identified, language barriers, cultural barriers, all sorts of resistance. And particularly post-COVID, we seem to have even higher degrees of distrust of government. So we're kind of digging ourselves out, I think, here in terms of, that's why I'm back to, Daniel, the point you've made again and again around local networks. When you ask people who they trust, neighbors, I think, always score quite highly, right? You trust your neighbors, right? Mm-hmm.
And then typically city a little bit lower, and then regional lower, and then national is the lowest, right? So we build trust up for interactions, right? People that we interact with regularly, those are people that we trust. They know our names. They may have the keys to our house, or we walk our dogs together, our kids go to school together. All of those are obvious ways that social scientists track the kind of connections that we have. If you've never met your congressperson or your senator, it's pretty unlikely you're going to first think of them when you have a problem. They might be the last person that you call after you try to work it out locally. Just want to add one thing to what both Jeb and James already said. I always point out to city managers, we don't need to give the same resources to the entire city. It's funny, we use the word equity, but I think we kind of misuse it. It's not that every community, for example, I live in Boston. It's not that every community in Boston needs the same investments. Some need a lot more than others because of both historical and ongoing problems in those communities, right? Historical that we've caused as a city, and ongoing that we're not helping as a city. So oftentimes, whether I'm working in Cambridge or Boston, San Francisco, I point out that we should be thinking about mapping these communities' social resources. Once we figured out who is, in a sense, the red zones, the hot zones that don't really have those connections, that's where we need to go. In the same way that Eric Kleinenberg pointed out, the intersection between elderly poverty, elderliness, poverty, and being alone was the red zone. So I completely agree. Thinking about investments, we don't need coverage for the most, every person in the city. We need, especially in those communities that have historically been underserved and now have that bigger gap between where they're holding in terms of trust and communities nearby that have always had a positive relationship with the decision makers nearby.
And then the dilemma we've got, the squaring the circle, is that you then have local councils that are in most cases elected by a particular neighborhood, and they aren't as often willing to actually think about what the other neighborhoods need that might be different than they're arguing on behalf of their constituency alone. Okay, well, let's talk. We've only got a few more minutes, and I just always want to give people a chance to sort of leave us with what you think the priority could be. But before we get to that, I do want to talk about money. I want to know whether or not there are financial tools out there that could compel us all to make different decisions that would make our communities, neighborhoods more resilient. Should it actually start to cost more to do the wrong thing? It's a very controversial question. Jim, you must live with this in Miami all the time, and then Jeb. Should it cost more to do the wrong thing?
Everything, if you're talking about the real estate investment that happens in any community, it's always a question of what is the value of land and what is the competition for that. And in a coastal community, that sort of always lands on the question of who's closest to the water. Yep. So we live with that. I don't think there's a coastal community, at least in this country, that doesn't have this kind of phenomena where, frankly, the real estate values that may support the rest of the community are located right near the water.
Yep.
They're creating a surplus of tax revenue, which the local elected officials have the right to use to support services that are further away. So that's a trap because it's in terms of the areas of vulnerability, they're very vulnerable. So how do you get out of that trap? Is not easy. We're looking at everything from Well, you know, we're always dealing with the cost of insurance. That's both government affected in the United States and in Florida. Florida handles the wind insurance as a state. And obviously, federal government handles flood insurance, and the private market tries to build in between. But that's a pretty blunt instrument, and remember, it only lasts for a year, and then you get your policy renewal. So it's not like you're making a mortgage decision. So. Right. But it's hard for government, I think, to do much more than that. We are trying to use financing tools that allow us to, they're basically general obligation bonds that allow us to pay now for investments, you know, that'll pay back over long term, and especially for things in terms of resilience. The local governments here can put a bond issue on the ballot and usually succeed if they call it a resilience bond issue.
It's interesting.
Even our schools do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are some people will spend for schools, won't they? Okay, we're in sort of the home stretch here, folks. So I'm going to ask people just to quickly give us a comment about what you think the takeaway should be in terms of going forward to be more prepared, more resilient, all those things. Jeb, to you, then Daniel, and then last and never least to you, Julie. So Jeb, Daniel.
Two things. I don't have an answer for it. The first one is we've learned through COVID that we had a bunch of things that were good urban planning, good urban practice that were being held up that actually served us to get through the crisis. I think we have to go back and look at the inventory of all the other things we've been trying to get done and ask ourselves how we can accelerate. Crisis moments are critical moments to accelerate. And so, we don't want crisis. We want to prevent people from suffering them, but we've got to use them well. And then just the last thing on the finance, land value capture. We can't go on about it, but we allow land value to be captured by the private sector. It needs to be captured by the public sector to address it.
Yeah, a perfect topic for another day as we look at how land use decisions are being made and transit and all that kind of stuff. To you, Daniel, and then clean up to Julie. Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, the message for me would be moving away from standard physical infrastructure investment, seawalls, moving houses, and so forth, into really building up social infrastructure, because we know using at least the social benefit analysis, those paybacks are much higher.
You heard it here first from Daniel Aldrich. Thanks, Daniel. Julie, last word to you. It's all about the people. Go for you.
Yeah, it is about people. And I think we're going to continue to experience these interconnected crises. And so we need to better prepare for them. And part of that is building relationships and moving outside of our silos and recognizing that everyone has a role to play in reducing these risks, not just disaster and emergency management professionals. So we need to rethink how we work together.
I think we need to come back for another panel and talk about how do we create those new kinds of reciprocal trust-based relationships, because during COVID we had to do it, and then I worry that we're going to go back to our own little narrow little way, and we're going to lose that muscle to reach out to somebody. So thanks everybody for joining us. Great to see you again, Daniel. Jim, nice to meet you. Jeb, always great to have you. And Julie, thank you for bringing us really into a grounded place in terms of it's all about people in the practice of what resilience really is. It's an interrelational piece. So thanks, everybody. We have one next week.
Mary. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Happy Thanksgiving to our
American
friends. And I'll see you next week in the next one. Thanks, gang.
Bye, everybody.